Joining us to discuss September 11th is William Lawrence. He's a Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at American University. Thanks very much for your time, William. How does 9/11 continue to impact the US today and the American psyche?
In myriad ways. Shivli Telhami, a professor at University of Maryland, talks about each country's prisms of pain, the events through which they view the world in often a distorting way, in a very emotional way. Every country has them. For the United States, perhaps the most important one in my lifetime is 9/11. And many things have happened since then. And we had this global war on terrorism, multiple wars that went on for decades. The DNA analysis of the body still continues to this day as DNA research advances. And just last week, they identified 2 more bodies that died in the towers. Certainly our whole homeland security infrastructure, our intelligence infrastructure was transformed after 9/11. Today I just gave a speech this morning to a bunch of military and government officials from around the world who come in for training. And there were lots of references to 9/11, which continues to impact their thinking as they prepare for disasters in their countries. So it really lives on. I found it interesting today that Biden gave the speech the first time a president gave it on the West Coast, and Kamala Harris didn't give a speech, although she's got 5 more hours looking at my clock. She's given speeches in previous years. This year she didn't. Biden's speech was quite moving. He was a witness, of course, in Washington to what happened. Yes, it very much lives on in the American psyche.
So more than 20 years on, do you feel that families, those that have been affected, have been fairly compensated?
No, and they never could be. Certainly the special master who distributed 9/11 funds did a great job, and a lot of people got a lot of money. The bigger problem was that hundreds of thousands of people breathed the toxic smoke from the disaster in New York, and hundreds died. 341 firefighters died after 9/11 just from the toxic smoke that they inhaled. And those names are being etched on the various monuments now as also victims of 9/11. Think about the tens of thousands of Americans and others who died in the wars that grew out of 9/11 around the world. I mean, it really had a huge impact on a lot of families, particularly in small towns around the U.S. that are commemorating today, where thousands of local boys and girls volunteered for the U.S. military to go fight the American foes. Some went to Afghanistan for that. Others went to Iraq on the pretext that Iraq had been involved, which they hadn't. But it had a huge impact across the United States, from the biggest cities to the smallest towns.
And when we look at the situation now with Afghanistan, does it feel like America's war on terror has been futile, do you think?
No, not at all. And even though 75% of Afghans didn't want to live under the Taliban, and the U.S. shouldn't have left, something I've talked about many times, because they could have stayed with 2,500 troops and 20,000 contractors in Afghanistan and kept things relatively stable and the way most Afghans wanted them. The pullout of Afghanistan was the calculation Biden wanted, something he'd worked on for decades. He was against that prolonged intervention. But the war on terror goes on around the world. You know, the U.S. Operates in 30 or 40 countries around the world in counterterrorism operations. There are lots of operations around Maghreb, Sahel, West Africa that I follow quite closely. ISIS has been severely degraded. Al-Qaeda has been severely degraded. But the war's not over, and there are other spin-off groups that have cropped up that will continue to cause problems around the world.
So what longer-term questions has the US departure from Afghanistan left with regards to US foreign policy and America's place in the world?
Well, I think it's been criticized justly, correctly, for the withdrawal, which didn't have to happen, and that was both a mistake of the Trump administration and the Biden administration, in my opinion. But it left some questions in the minds of U.S. allies about, who they would stand with and who they would not stand with. Now, those that make the counter argument, like my friend Sarah Chase, who's a big Afghan expert, says that the corruption was so bad in Afghanistan it was a lost cause at the government level. And there's a perfectly good argument there that all the money put into Afghanistan led to all of this corruption in part, and then the whole thing fell apart like a house of cards. I don't really share that view. I don't think Afghanistan is really the example of how things are going around the world. The U.S. just held, a summit of 100 democracies, two versions of it in the U.S. The G20 summit, in my mind, was a very big success as the country aligns around common challenges. The world aligns around common challenges, with the U.S. in a greater leadership role following the Trump administration's sort of going back to an America First policy. Now the U.S. is beginning to play its larger role in the world. As the world's most powerful, richest nation, they have a role to play, as does China, as do all the big powers. So, here we are in a more globalized world where anybody is vulnerable and everybody's dealing with the same challenges. If I could just add, I remember on my long trip to China in 2016, after China had been attacked in a variety of ways by terrorists, the thinking had changed in China in very profound ways, kind of like what had happened in America after 9/11. And all around the world, we're seeing countries sharing best practices, sharing intelligence, working together, even when they have prickly relationships in other ways. What you might call the 9/11 cause, the war on terror cause, really brings together a lot of countries. That's why there were nearly 100 countries in the counter-ISIS coalition during that period after 2015.
All right, William, really appreciate your reflections on this day of remembrance. William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at American University.
Pleasure.